Hey, good morning.
Hey, good morning.
Is the cloud native security con next week? Is that what it is? I forget.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Are
it's
you guys
Cloud
going
Native.
after that?
So I'll be out there mostly on behalf of tag security. So I actually have a talk on behalf of I'll be talking about supply chain stuff and what we've been doing in tag security for supply chain.
Cool.
Um, my company, I won't be doesn't have any talks out
Okay.
there.
Okay.
Um, but I will also there's a bunch of other meetings and potential customers and all that good stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. Very cool. That sounds fun. I'm not going, unfortunately. I
No,
wish I was.
what's the next one you're going to?
Not planned. So we'll
Uh,
see. Sometime, somewhere. Who knows?
Yeah, KubeCon Europe should be interesting. There's going to be a whole area dedicated to security.
Oh, cool. That's
Yeah,
great.
so there'll be like a whole section of like booths and whatever that are like specifically like open source security. So it'll be
Oh,
run
wow.
by the CNCF and like, hey, here's different interesting tag security projects and all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's great. Nice.
Let me share the meeting notes here. Give me 1 second. Yeah, feel free to add your name and anything you want to add to the agenda. I only have one minor thing on the agenda. Still trying to kind of, I know a lot of folks, as people have mentioned, a lot of folks who are hands-on keyboard engineers tend to not attend, these sorts of meetings. And so a lot of the folks who are maintainers of some of the projects, some of it's just because some of the maintainers of some of the salsa projects are out on the West Coast, and this time is way too early for them. And some folks are actually one of the other maintainers, he's actually out in Japan and it's like 11 p.m. there or something. So that's also difficult. So we're going to try and maybe reach out and figure out like better way, like a better time that works for everybody. Because we do want to see if we can get some of the maintainers of some of these projects on. It doesn't have to be all the time, but like even just like once a month to be on this call so that we can sync up on some of the things that we're looking to do. So we can get started. Just as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. It'll be uploaded to YouTube shortly thereafter, as well as your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF code of conduct. All right, so before getting into the one agenda item, is there anything folks wanted to bring up? Any updates? Anything interesting that folks wanted to bring up regarding Salsa and Salsa tooling? As a reminder, we're focused on a lot of the 1.0 release stuff.
And I may be looking at the wrong, I apologize. I'm using a different computer for notes. Am I looking at the wrong meeting notes?
You might be.
Okay.
So what ended up happening, and I don't know if it's still the case, there was a set of notes. That set of notes somehow got locked. Oh no! I can see that you put your name in the attendees list. So
I signed him in.
Someone else, yes.
Oh, okay.
I'll throw, yeah, all right.
Yeah. I'll put it in Slack. Is that it?
Cool.
Can you see that?
Yeah,
Okay.
that'll be helpful in Slack. Yeah, for sure. Sorry
Yeah.
about that interruption.
Yep. Okay.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, so somehow I guess like at the end of the year, something happened with the OpenSSF stuff and it locked everything. It locked the calendar invite. It locked
Got it. All right.
or rather expired the calendar invite. And whatever. Cool. So the only thing on the agenda was, so I wanted to provide a little bit of an update. I spoke to the software repos, or securing software repos group, the APAC group, not the EMEA group. One second. So what was I gonna say? So I spoke to the protecting software repos group on Wednesday about if there's interest among the various ecosystems like npm, PyPI, Gem, Ruby Gems, and so on, Maven Central, for starting to develop either or a set of like practices on how to store and distribute, or I think actually more distribute. The storing doesn't really necessarily matter, but how to distribute SLSA packages, SLSA provenance for packages that are deployed into these ecosystems or that are stored in these ecosystems. And so the idea would be trying to kind of create a consistent set of rules, if possible, make it easier for folks to implement. And then the second thing is even better is if there's something like, and I don't, something like OCI, right? Like you can imagine, hey, something, but much simpler, just purely for like, and maybe you could even just sort of say we could use OCI. I don't know, it doesn't matter to me. But if there's some way where we can say, hey, here is a basic API with some verbs and whatever to sort of say, here's how one would download download provenance for a package. Then, as opposed to the SLSA tooling that might need to verify across, let's say, 5 or 6 different ecosystems, instead of having to make 5 or 6 different implementations of here's the Gem API for how they download, how you can download provenance spec, provenance documents. Here's, the NPM one, here's, the PyPI and so on. Instead of having to do all of those, if there's largely a consistent thing across all of them, then you could just implement it once.
My comment to that would be like, from an API perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense because I can't imagine it would be too complicated. Like a fairly simple REST API would probably do it. I would more think about sort of the schema for distributing these attestations, because that's where I think it can get a little bit hairy. Like as an example, in NPM, we're going to rely on the SIG-Store bundle format, which allows us to capture certificate chains and other cryptographic materials, or at least like the public part of it, used during the signature time. So for a verifier, they get everything served to them upfront, and they only need to have like root certificates and intermediate certificates or public keys. So the bundle itself is sort of self-contained, like the provenance is there and the public part of all the keys is also there, and some other proofs, like for instance, the bundle order entry from a record that sort of proves, or at least shows, the promise of the artifact signature transparency and other parts. So it's a fairly big piece of data. It's not just the actual provenance itself. So, and I know from other parts that I don't think they are, or maybe they are looking into use the bundle. I'm not sure. Like, but for me, at least, that's where I think the biggest discussion would be.
Yeah, that makes sense. I forgot about the bundle piece. Some of us have just been using the which comes with its own set of things. So there's the bundle, because there's also we've mostly been using JSON, just the JSON lines, Dizzy envelope stuff, but we recognize that that's not flexible enough to do everything. And so yeah, so there's the bundle. That's so is that fully ironed out and accepted, or is that still being?
It is accepted as currently it's released under 0.1.0 version, but it's, I mean, it has gone through a fairly deep review, so I would say it's definitely stable or reliable enough to start use. We know of some future changes that are coming, but when, we have no idea. And as an example, even though it is like a Sigstore bundle, it's inherently not tied to Sigstore. You can rely on whatever PKI you would like to, like any certificate authority will work. Any RFC 3161 timestamping service is totally gonna work if you just rely on a set of private public key pair. That's totally fine. You're not enforced to use record or anything like that. It's more like, I wouldn't say Swiss Army knife, but it does support a lot of different techniques to sort of gain confidence in the signature, like as an example, an array of counter signatures from a timestamping authority, or a bunch of RICO servers that witnessed and accepted and went transparent with the signatures. And a generic like way of specifying, hey, here is a certificate authority that was used to give me a signing certificate, etc. So it's not, you're not forced to use Sigstore by using the bundle, but obviously it sort of came from the direction or supporting the different services that's offered by the Sigstore ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, to take even a step back, I think, so from the conversation, I'll start writing up some notes in the agenda as well. So there was a few things. One, and this was stuff that I know I've already talked with some of the homebrew folks and some of the other people, is largely some ecosystems. So I'll put this out. So some ecosystems are actually rather different interest at different levels between ecosystems. So some have said they want to, be involved in developing a spec/standard. Some have said, there you go. So let me just hold on. Some want to be involved in developing spec or standard. Some want to be involved in implementing what others decide, right? And don't want to themselves be, they're like, hey, look, we don't have enough time and yada, yada. But if somebody comes in and says, you use this library or use this spec, we will do that. And then some largely want to be left out. So there's some folks who more or less said, hey, look, we're not going to prevent others from, let's say, generating this stuff, but we're not going to support it directly. And so, for example, Homebrew in particular seemed to indicate that, they're like, look, we don't want to get involved in any of that. There's a few folks who indicated they might want to, but more from just like if you just, like they're not making any guarantees on anything. They're just sort of saying, here is a place where to look up extra metadata, and they are okay with sort of potentially pointing people to that sort of thing. But beyond that, they're not going to really support some of that. And there's a few others that seem to indicate like, yeah, probably not. So there's like three levels, or there between the ecosystems. I believe the major ecosystems like your GEMS, your NPM, your PyPI, and so on, they seem interested in being involved. There's a few other smaller ones that seem to maybe not wanted to sort of implement what others decide, but not get involved on some of the other stuff. And then, yeah, some of the other ones. Once again, this is mostly just hearing through from some folks who are involved but are not representatives of those ecosystems. But I've heard like Homebrew, Gentoo, a few others probably just, they're like, hey, look, we're really not going to be involved in building that out. Okay. So the other thing, oh, go ahead.
Just one comment. This from the SLSA, like the SLSA GitHub generator and the SLSA verifier, it's on the roadmap as well to support the Sigstr bundle. So there are coming from more directions than just NPM.
Oh yeah. No, I know that. Yeah.
Cool.
And in fact, I'm totally on board with folks supporting the bundle. Too many things going on. It's hard to keep track. Actually, give me 1 second. I just need to make sure I tell somebody that we need to support the bundle. Yeah, so the other thing to take a step back, some folks had brought up, like, even beyond talking about the API, a couple of things of like, whatever we do, looking, this was coming from Jacques from he's not a representative of GEMS, but he's like, hey, based on my experience working with GEMS and doing this, that, and the other thing, they said, there's probably some principles that we want to have in there. One is make it CDN friendly, right? We shouldn't be doing a ton of application server logic on every request, if possible, right? Because they were saying, he was saying last he checked, there's probably on the order of several million requests to GEMS every hour, I think he said. There's a few million, and once again, I know NPM is closer to on the order of billions. But yeah, there's a lot of those sorts of things. And so he said, hey, the more easily we can cache this stuff, the better and the cheaper it makes it for, a lot of that sort of stuff. And he said, the more sorts of search style requests, the harder it's going to be to sort of allow that, at least, broadly, because, especially if lots of folks are doing that.
That just a comment as well, like this is definitely something we have been discussing from NPM's perspective as well. And I think we were discussing this last Friday, like sort of the proposed API format we have. And basically it is like a simple URL with the package name and version in it. So it's like super easy to cache or whatever caches that might be there, like either a CDN or something in front of it or back of it. So we were looking to different solutions as well, like batch requests and things like that, which most likely will be like an HTTP post, and so inherently not something you will cache. So that's one of the reasons we started to look into using single request HTTP gets.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Another thing that was brought up, and this is by a few folks, and I think we had discussed this last week as well, which was should separate out the package from the metadata documents. So by that I mean, we don't want to include it in the actual sort of tarball. And the reason for that being that, if folks want to pull down SLSA metadata first and essentially validate, does this package have SLSA metadata before I even pull it down? And then separately, there was a thing of, it makes it difficult because some folks have like just said, oh yeah, what I've done is I have my package and then I have some metadata and then I wrap all of it together in like a tarball or a zip or whatever. But that leads to other issues because then it becomes, then you have to download the package plus everything, and then you have to unpack it and then compare, hey, is the extra bit in this tarball actually what's, do the hashes line up? And it becomes kind of a mess, compared to just sort of saying, hey, I have this, I can check the checksum or whatever, and then when I download the package, I can essentially verify right there, and it makes it easy. What else was there? Yeah, so I think some of the common things that people had talked about were for a single package beyond batch requests package, there should be a consistent path for finding the various provenance documents. So another thing that was brought up a little bit was to potentially get additional input and feedback, is we might just want to say this is an API that could just download arbitrary metadata documents, so that we don't have to say, and here is a separate API for downloading SBOMs, and here's a separate API for downloading security scans. This is just an API for downloading those things. And I think the thing that folks had brought up is they just want to, tie it into some of the CDN stuff, but also tie it into just sort of making it simple for everybody. Is there should be some way to easily have the endpoint or the paths in the API know that, like, hey, if I download version 1.3 of this package, I can do, the package name / the version name / salsa or whatever, or, and it should download me the salsa bundle, or if I do / SBOM or whatever, it should download me the SBOM or what have you. I think that sort of thing is a few folks had brought up as important, partially because of the CDN piece, because it makes it very easy to just sort of say, great, this can be easily cached. We could just literally have those be flat files. It doesn't have to be a whole API request and whatever. And then also it makes it easy for potentially multiple, because I know one of the other things that's coming up is, yeah, like you have salsa verifiers. A lot of folks are starting to come in with batch requests, as you had sort of mentioned, of like, I want to download all SBOMs related to for the entire life cycle of this package, because I want to be able to see what has changed over time, and see, hey, this previous version was using this package, and then this new version seems to be using a typo squatted version of that same package. What happened? It helps people answer those sorts of things. And so I think there's like a handful of those things that people had talked about. So not next week, but the week after, I'm going to be doing another, not presentation, I have like 4 slides, just kind of talking about the high level stuff to the EMEA group, because the APAC group, there's only like 6 people on. But the EMEA group, I know, tends to have like 15 or 20 people on. At least that's what they said. There's a lot more folks. And so I'm going to show off to some of them, just try and get some feedback and get some input there. Yeah. And also people seemed interested in, hey, if NPM has already done, let's say 60–70% of the work already, then maybe we could just more or less, do some of that. The other thing I did bring up is, I did say a few times, is we want to keep this simple. Actually, that's another principle. And part of that is, I don't want to pick on Brendan Mitchell, but yeah, as you know, like, hey, the more complicated, the more API nouns and verbs there are, and yada yada, before you know it, it becomes a year or something like that before anything can get decided on. I think the thing that we're trying to say is, hey, keep it dead simple, and hope for the best, and hope certain types of people don't end up being like, hey, well, no, we can't do this. We need to do this one, and that kind of thing.
Oh, you make it as easy as you want to, and people still mess it all up in the last
Yeah,
minute. So
yeah, I am very prepared for that. I do think I've noticed in the community a little bit, which seems to have worked largely, is sometimes you ask for forgiveness as opposed to permission. Like, oh yeah, the spec isn't completely done, but we implemented something based on a draft of the spec, and before you know it, that draft of the spec just becomes the spec because everybody's like, well, this thing supports it, which I also know is kind of a it's the sledgehammer to the problem. But I think if it gets that, we might be able to just, I don't know. But anyway, cool. Yeah. Cool. So that's, I think, about it from, do other folks have thoughts on the API spec? Aaron, I know you as an end user might have some thoughts.
Yeah, you know, having that kind of like linkage, kind of like you mentioned, one of these principles, right, of like the consistent path is really important. I was just kind of bootstrapping and just like kind of like going from the ground up around just a simple signature on a Python wheel, uploading the Python wheel up to like a private PyPy registry, but then I can't upload the signature today to the private Python, you know, PyPy registry. So then I had to upload the signature somewhere else. So like being able to have that all kind of like in somewhere consistent would be very helpful. So it makes a lot of sense.
just because I've missed a bunch of these, probably every other one of them. When you talk about making an API spec, a lot of what we talk about is trying to generate artifacts, generate source provenance on something that's already pushed up to package repo, npm, or CI images, pick wherever they are. Each one of those has their own completely distinct APIs. You know, nothing you can work with there. Are you proposing making another repository, or where are you going with this?
So this is, and Frederick, tell me if I'm off base here with how NPM plans to do this, is potentially this could just be 2 requests, right? You have the request to gems, pip, whatever for your actual package. But separately, there is a REST API that various groups can run that you could just sort of say, okay, well, like it could be a minor change to the CLI for these tools and the various tools that, let's say, use them. But the idea is potentially to not really impact the actual download the package API, and just sort of say, hey, if somebody is downloading this thing, they would just take this data regarding their package, the version, yada, yada, to a REST API and be able to pull down additional metadata. And with the idea here that most likely gems, PyPI, et cetera, would run this API. And once again, they could implement it however they want to, as long as it sort of meets the spec. And the idea would be potentially, let's say pip, for example. I go in and let's say the pip CLI either has a plugin or the new version of the pip CLI supports this API. You could go and say, okay, great. I run, you know, pip install -- check salsa or whatever. Great. It goes and like looks up, you know, based on pip install requests or whatever, that is, okay, what's the latest requests? Cool. check check that API. Okay, yes, I pulled down the salsa. Cool, pull down the package, check the two. Cool, it looks good or whatever. But the idea, at least from my opinion, and I want to get other folks' thoughts too, is that because it's that way, it would be backwards compatible. We wouldn't have to worry about like, oh no, now everybody has to do this thing. It's like, no, everything should still work. But if folks now want to do the additional piece of checking the SBOM, checking the salsa, it's just a separate API request to this other thing. And in addition to that, right, like if other folks are like, hey, look, I don't want to run this thing, but if you want to run it, great. Then you could do something like check salsa. Here is the API to actually check the salsa or whatever. I think that's kind of the thing we want to do. And yeah, we don't want to change the package API for everybody because we recognize that everybody's going to want to do it their own way, yada, yada. But for the metadata, I think that might be a little simpler. Oh, Frederick, I noticed you posted some stuff. Do you want to talk about how NPM is looking at it?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, yeah, I posted an example URL, how it may look like in the chat. So that's sort of the simple REST API we are going after. And probably not implemented as of now, but for managing, let's say, SBOMs or volume scans or whatever might be, like the way we're thinking about it would probably be like a query parameter to filter by predicate type. Everything would still be packed like in a DC envelope. So it would be consistent for the verifier to unpack and understand what everything is. As part of publishing, we are currently doing it together with when you're publishing the package, like it's sort of just an extra attribute that gets along in the upload request. So there is still like a single call to do publishing, but that I don't think is as important, like the read part is what I think is more interesting because like, yeah, share verifiers and things like that, policy engines.
Are you looking to piggyback on top of already existing APIs, or is this like NPM has to add this new API here? Let me give you the reason for the question that might help explain this. A lot of this reminds me a little bit of Notary version 1, where they basically came up with a separate API you had to query to verify signatures of container images. The API included things like the image name in there, and it was a separate server you had to run, separate ports, all that kind of stuff. And the community never adopted it. There are multiple issues. I won't dig into all of them, but at least one of them was, hey, we've got to query the separate API. We can't move the images, and images very frequently do move. That might not be quite the same as what's faced in other package ecosystems where things don't move as much, but that was one of the challenges they ran into, where people want to move the images, but they couldn't copy the signature because the signature was hard code to only go with that one name. And just separately running another separate server, separate API that people had to query was a challenge. And so that was one of the big efforts behind a lot of what was going on with the OCI lately. It's been saying, how can we put this in the container image repository itself? Makes sense. Makes sense where I'm going with that.
So I think for NPM, I would think it's a slightly bit of a different case, as we're primarily targeting like the sort of the public version of the NPM, which is like a single service deployed, maybe not a single service, but it's one service deployed and a bunch of consumers. We, of course, are going to or have published the API specs, so any NPM like registries or proxies can implement it. Then again, I would still say it's up to them how they would like to sort of store this metadata. Maybe they already have like a relational database. It would be fairly easy to just have another column where you can sort of squash in this attestation data. So I think, or at least I hope, it shouldn't be as challenging. And for moving packages and things like that, I don't think it's supported in NPM to move a package. Like if you would like to sort of transfer ownership, you would pretty much have to open up a new scope and then redeploy. And as part of that deployment, hopefully you should have a new build. And so you should have a new set of provenance documents to upload with it. So I do think, global. Yeah.
Is NPM a single global namespace for everything? It's not like you're
it's both
from different servers. Okay.
You can have what's I would say unscoped packages, and then you can claim a specific scope, and then you can publish your packages under that scope. So as an example, just to pick like a pretty big scope would be like Babel, and under the Babel namespace, you have, or the Babel scope, you have a bunch of packages that the Babel organization owns and manage. So it's both. I would think that most big packages are namescope.
Namespace. Yeah.
Yeah, or namespace. Yeah, I'm just mixing namespace and scope in my head, and then it gets confusing. I think the official name is scope for NPM, but yeah, the concept is the same.
Yeah, that's been the one cautionary tale I'm throwing out there is just knowing how Notary version 1 has so many issues with some of the things.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we don't
Thanks.
repeat some of their mistakes, because it's been an effort on the OCI side getting a lot of that stuff undone.
Yeah, thanks. I think, or at least my assumption would be that it's more common for organizations to run private OCI registries than running node registries. But I don't know, like there are players around that are offering this as a service. GitHub, for instance, would be one. I know, like Artifactory and a bunch of others. So what I'm kind of hoping is that a lot of vendors look into those offerings instead, where sort of everything is coming out of the box.
The Artifactory is where I was originally thinking, because I feel like a lot of big organizations, they'll say, you can write all the code you want, but you can only depend on the stuff that's come through our organization, has been scanned and approved. And I think part of the scanning and approving is going to be looking, does it have this also attestations in the future?
Yeah, I think that should be an interesting one as well, because when thinking about this, I was thinking about the JFrogs and the Sonatypes and those folks. When talking to some of them and how they've currently been handling it, thus far, they've just sort of said, oh, we just have a repo. Like, since in Artifactory and Sonatype Nexus, you could just sort of have a flat file repo as well. And we just sort of say, oh, yeah, like either we have a flat file that's, sits right next to the package, or we have a flat file in a separate repo and we have some scripts to sort of verify those two things. I think from that end, it would be interesting to also get some of their input on it to see how simple this would be, right? Like, I do think that if we make something like the simplest bit of the spec just be, here's what the path should look like, then it should be very simple for somebody to say, oh, great, like Sonatype and Artifactory already support this, because it would just be server / attestation or whatever / package name, yada, yada. And then that should be just very simple to implement, compared to potentially like some sort of extra API that now Artifactory or Nexus would have to support. Aaron?
Yeah, and maybe this is kind of a little bit of what I was talking about with what I was doing with trying to just do signatures for a wheel file in Python. Like, I had to host my Python wheel in PyPy private registry, right? But then I had to host the signature in basically a flat file generic storage. And then, for my end users, I just have a shell script where they curl both of those things and then compare it with cosine, right? It's like kind of simple. So I think the work, right, is that pathing, right, for that flat storage for the metadata. But the actual work is on the ecosystem for the consuming portion, right? So like for when you're doing like NPM, the work is really where that install and it's expecting it to get that thing, right? So like, I think that's where the rubber meets the road specifically. Does that make sense? I think that's where it all comes together. Making it flat is easier, obviously, like you're alluding, Michael. So
yeah, I mean, I do think that there's and once again, I don't want to get too deep into like the implementation, right? But I can imagine, right, where there is a set of musts, right? Like, you must support this sort of pathing. And then there's probably a bunch of should or coulds that are maybe more like batch style, like, hey, look, you say, hey, look, we can't support batch because we're going to get slammed. hey, that's fine. You just need to support the flat file stuff or whatever. I think even just sort of something like that is probably okay for most folks. And I'm also thinking about some of this when I start to look at like some folks have like the batch stuff. I think it's going to be useful because a lot of folks have begun to ask questions of, there's no way to batch collect a bunch of SBOMs for stuff like research purposes. And a lot of folks are getting very, they're like, hey, I have to go through a list of, you know, and I get that this is to some extent, this is also the why list images inside of a OCI registry is usually disabled for all public registries, like so that people don't go around crawling all images. Actually, Brendan probably has a better, like I assume it's because they don't want to get slammed with a ton of like, you know,
the authentication APIs are all based on repository, and the API to query the list of all repositories. Therefore, you can't really scope that to a single login at that point,
okay.
or a single login session at that point. So it basically means you're opening the query list up to everybody, or you have to do some fancy authentication stuff that gets really complicated.
Okay, never mind then. Yeah, but yeah, that actually is something that if you're running a private repository, you probably now have to deal with, which is just, you know, NPM. It's not a big deal, but you could imagine if somebody's running an Artifactory with thousands and thousands of packages, some of those packages might be scoped to different teams, and then yeah. So okay, so that's actually it's good that I hadn't even considered that. I had just assumed it was more of like, we don't want folks like trying to list all images and crawl across all of that.
I'm sure there's some of that, but every time you make a query and say, I want to pull the Alpine image from Docker Hub sends you over their authentication server and says, give me an access token that gives you the rights to access the Alpine repository for just a pull request or a pull query. And so that's part of the API going back and forth. And so the scoping around the one that says list all repositories, it basically have to say list every repository this user has access to and send that to the authentication server. And that's something I think a lot of authentication servers just don't want to deal with.
Cool. So, all right. Does anybody actually know anybody else who might be interested from any of these groups? I know we've spoken to briefly the Trail of Bits folks, who I know are working on some of this for PIP. And this was a few months ago, and this is before we were thinking through this sort of idea. And it might make sense to sort of ping them and say, hey, this is something we're thinking about. Also, I think that I don't know what folks' thoughts are on including the SBOM like groups, or other sorts of groups who might be interested, or we should kind of come to them with, here's something that's relatively done. Do you want to add in? I recognize like this more from a practicality standpoint. Obviously, the more people that are involved, the more reasonable discussions. I mean, the more discussions there are, and the more reasonable objections there are. But at the same time, it's like, hey, great. If we come to something like, hey, here's SLSA, does the SBOM want to just get in? It's an easier discussion than, hey, we're about to build a thing. And once again, not to say that we shouldn't include anybody, but I'm just trying to think through some practical elements here. And I know one of the reasons why SLSA, at least in my opinion, has been so successful has largely been, hey, we have a steering committee. It's relatively lightweight. Lots of minor revisions are super easy to get in. And stuff like, implementations are super simple to kind of, we've been able to kind of get a lot of tooling out there really quick because of that sort of lightweight touch. So I'm curious if folks have thoughts about who else should be included. If folks even in this group, obviously Frederick has already, I know we've been talking about some of this, but if other folks are interested in being a bit more involved, I'd be interested in hearing about that.
I'm interested in getting involved and like putting hands on keyboard, but I'm right at the edge of who knows what, let's say, and that's all I'll say. So we'll see in the next month where I land with certain things. So that'll decide if I can put hands on keyboard for this kind of thing.
All right. Yeah, I sorry, go Brandon.
I was just looking back through some of the old notes and seeing exactly what the scope of this group is, because I feel like if you try to scope it too much on we want to handle all the distribution of SLSA artifacts, you're going to run into exactly what we're running into now, that NPM does it one way or CIM just does it a different way, pip does it their own way. And it becomes a fractal issue where everybody's doing something slightly differently and we're trying to write a spec that tries to cover the world.
Oh yeah, I think the idea here is for us to define something. If other people want to do something different, great, that's fine. Like we're trying not to be, I think, prescriptive in it too much, but the idea would be, at least in my opinion, NPM is already done most of the work. There's probably a couple of things in here that we might just want to say, hey, does it make sense to maybe broaden this a little bit or restrict this a little bit more and provide that sort of feedback? And then largely just say, hey, let's do this. Maybe have SLSA have, you know, like NPM is going to have, and I don't know if NPM is open sourcing the actual implementation or whatever of that thing, but to either, you know, take that implementation or build a separate sort of, hey, here's how anybody can run a SLSA, you know, a SLSA metadata repository. And it's just a, you know, I'm sure since everything we've done so far is mostly in Go, I'm sure it'll be some simple Go sort of, you know, API. And, you know, these are the sorts of things. And I think that's kind of the thing here, like, because one of the things that was kind of brought up in some of the other SLSA meetings was just, a lot of folks are asking these questions and they're just like, how should I do this? And so there's two separate pieces. One is at the highest level, we should probably have a set of, here are some reasonable practices you should do. Like, for example, please don't package the attestation alongside the package itself. Don't package it up with the actual artifact in a way that it becomes difficult to figure out what's the SLSA and what's the, you know what I mean, that sort of thing. There's some other basic things that would be, you know, like with some of this stuff is like, hey, if you can, another best practice is try and make it easy for folks to download just the SLSA attestation, because in many cases, they're going to want to have the SLSA attestation first, run it through some policy before determining whether or not they should download the package, right? And like some basic things like that, some basic best practices, then probably something like, hey, here is here is a spec that hits those best practices. And here is maybe, I know in OpenSSF, we don't want to say reference anymore because that causes people to freak out, but a example implementation, a Sterling implementation of that thing, and point that at that.
Yeah, the thought I'm going through is I hate to see us put too much effort on how to do that just for SLSA, and then someone else comes back, how do I do this for SBOMs? Someone else comes back, says, how do I do this for signatures? It almost feels like the direction of making these slices and delegations and how you make the tooling fits better with, let's talk about how we do all of those for NPM. Sort of how we do all of those for, you know, each of the different package ecosystems out there. And that way we can say these are kind of the best practice guiding principles for all of these things. that we're trying to do, but not restrict it and saying we're just doing the SLSA attestations across the board, slice it differently.
Yeah. So I guess I have a question for you that, like, so to be clear, I agree. And that's why also in what I've been showing the folks, I said, this is not purely SLSA, it could be other things as well. And we want to support those other things. I guess the question I would have is, is there any concern that you start to, let's say, include, let's say, the VEX folks and the SBOM folks and some of the other folks, and all of a sudden, everybody has a slightly differing opinion on how this should all be put together, and then it becomes,
But if you've got a different solution for how you attach VEX data, metadata into NPM than you do for how do you attach the SBOM, and everybody's got a slightly different API, that feels even worse to me.
Oh, sorry. So to put on my evil villain hat on, the secret plan here, right, is I think to start with SBOM, start with SLSA, with the idea of saying, hey, we've been looking at it in this way, and we know that SBOM and VEX are a little bit, like, they're still trying to figure some of these things out. Oh, do you just want to come on to what we've built and now come, like, or what we've sort of built, like, in a V0.1, and now drive it to the 1.0, as opposed to saying we don't have anything and now, like, because I think there's, and I guess I'd be curious to get folks' thoughts, at least from my perspective. Sometimes if you come with even a POC, that POC very quickly becomes refined into an actual thing, rather than, hey, there's obviously a need, and then everybody kind of has wildly different ideas on what the implementation is.
To give context on the OCI side for anybody that hadn't been down those weeds as much as I have, which is probably nobody. The way we're doing it is we're saying you attach your metadata to the image. The thing we know is we know the digest of the image. So that doesn't change, that's verified. You push your artifact there with some either APIs or other ways of pushing it up there. And the important data is just the media type of that data you're sending up there. And so if you push the VEX, you've got the media type for the VEX, and then everything within that is just an abstract blob. It's whatever the VEX people want to call it. And so all we need to know is, hey, here's the media type for VEX, here's the media type for Cyclone DX, here's the one for SPDX. Pick every one of these different, the SLSA metadata, all of that can just be a different media type. And then under that, inside the blob, that's for that team to fight out and argue and figure out.
Yep.
The SLSA team can go through and sort out, okay, this is how we want to format our metadata. All we care about is the media type there at that point.
So I have a bit of a loaded question for you then. Do you think, and this is just like, even if this is not the case, do you think if folks adopted OCI more generally for this sort of stuff, that it would solve a lot of these problems? Like,
oh, that's a very loaded question. Oh, there are too many things going on right now that just really complicate that question. Yeah, I don't think it solves the problem where we already have NPM, we already have PyPy, we already have all these other package ecosystems out there. And I feel like the place where you go and pull down your Linux image for, Debian package or something like that, it makes sense to keep all the metadata with the package itself, wherever that package ecosystem is, or at least alongside of it.
I mean, I was thinking, and Mike also even player too, I was thinking this, but didn't even want to say it because it sounds wild. What if PyPy or what if NPM adopted OCI as that distribution method, right? Like that would be interesting. I think that's what you're kind of saying, Michael, right?
There are some crazy people that have been using OCI images for packaging Debian or shipping Debian packages. So you're not too far out.
Yeah, and just to be clear, like, I would love it if everybody did that. And I know that there's some folks who have been, I don't know, looking to cache things and, put things into stuff and then, generating like, hey, here is the backing store and the backing store is OCI, and then whatever the AP, like, because at the end of the day, OCI is more of the backing store than anything, right? You could still have an API in front of it that is whatever, right? It's just, once again, I think the problem, right, is the backing store being OCI complicates a lot of folks who are just like, well, these are just files in a file system somewhere, and I just, pull them out in some other way. Yeah.
Yeah, the real complication is that you're stepping into the landmine, anthill, whatever it is right now that we have got an internal debate of whether or not we're going to make the artifact manifest. If anybody's been following that we standardized, whether we're actually going to release that right now or not. So the way that people have previously been shipping artifacts would still work, which is you ship them as an image manifest. But there's a lot of debate right now on other ways we can ship things. And I think the generic, do we ship everything in an OCI registry? I feel like you're going toward that latter, just shipping it with the artifact manifest, and that's where it's complicated right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think if everybody was doing the OCI piece, it would simplify. Well, it would simplify a lot of things on the consumption end, and it would simplify a lot of things from the tooling end and that sort of thing. It would just, there's the trade-off of now everybody from the production end of like, hey, the folks who run NPM, the folks who run PI and so on, now they have to, it's like, well, this is a significant amount of work on their end.
I mean, they already have package repositories for their stuff. I don't want to replace their work if they've already got something that's there. So that's where I take the step back and say, as much as I am representing all the stuff at OCI, I'm also not trying to overtake all the other projects.
Yeah. But I know that's one of the things we had talked about a couple of months ago in this group was like, hey, would folks be interested in taking some of the OCI stuff and just kind of running forward with that, because that will make things a lot easier. But then it just becomes this thing of, well, you're asking a lot of package, ecosystems, which in some cases have decades of this is how we've done it, and saying, actually now completely do it a different way and how you store everything. And that's not exactly the easiest ask. With that said, I think
herding cats was complicated. Herding open source developers is even worse.
Yeah, and it's not just, I agree, it's a lot of politics, but also having looked at some of the code and hearing from some of the developers, I don't know, I think it was like a PyPI one, where it's like some of the stuff like where people are like, why does PyPI do this silly thing? And it's like, well, if you look at it like, 15 years ago or whatever it was, this sort of decision was made because we couldn't see the future. And now it's an issue. But if we were to do, if we were to change this, it breaks all of these other things. And
don't try to turn on two-factor authentication, everybody.
Yeah. Well,
drama.
Yeah. I was about to say something, decided best against it. I mean, we still have folks who, I have seen a lot of folks who still argue that Python 3 is one of the worst decisions ever made. And there's elements of, I get it. At the same time, I'm a little worried if you're running code that is very obviously vulnerable to all these sorts of things that are 15 years old, unless those things are literally like, it's a self-enclosed, system that, nobody actually has access to. Great, sure, yeah, keep it running, it does its thing, and who cares? But if it's something that has access to the internet, I'd be very worried that you're running, a 15-year-old version of a thing and still saying, yeah, this should get a security patch. It's like, hold on, there's much newer versions of this thing. Yada. Anyway. Okay, I know we're at time. I think this gave us some. I'm gonna write up some additional things, put it into probably a Google Doc. Would love to get folks' thoughts on these things. I probably want to push this out to the SLSA maybe specification and SLSA positioning folks as well, as just like the biggest piece is more of, should we push this ahead? Like, should we push the standardization, or is this like a Sisyphean task here, right? Like, anyway.
Gotta run.
All right. Yeah. Same here.
Cool. Thank you.
Later.
See you later. Bye.